you are not the same person now that you were 12 months ago. But many of us still send the message to ourselves that we really aren't good at change, that we don't like change, that we're not willing to embrace it and move forward. Change happens instantly, but the transition that's needed takes time. Change really doesn't happen overnight. But most changes, with a well-managed transition, can easily be successful. So communicate, problem solve, and plan your way to readiness for change to happen. The whole process of change includes the transition that you and everybody around you is experiencing from start to finish. And it's only once that transition is concluded that change is successful. Don't manage change, lead it. Hey, welcome to the Leaders Podcast with me, Laura McDonald, the leadership coach and mentor. Come with me as I explore the elements of leadership that give leaders like you the power and confidence to make the impact you know you can. I'll be sharing my own experiences, top tips and insights, and talking to some very special guests to share their thoughts and leadership experiences on mindset, influence, change, and growth. So let's get right to it. What an absolute crazy year last year was for me. The last 12 months have been an absolute roller coaster. I have learned new skills, new knowledge, gained new behaviours, changed old habits into better ones. I have adjusted my mindset and done things that I never thought were possible. If you told me when I started my business that I'd be releasing a podcast, I would have laughed in your face. But I've done it. I'm here. And I'm doing this every week so I can help more leaders like you make the impact you know you can. Many of us look back on the last 12 months at the start of every year and think, not really a lot happened. Sometimes life can be a little bit boring. But I can tell you, no matter how boring or exciting your last 12 months have been, there's one thing I can absolutely guarantee you, and that is that you are not the same person now that you were 12 months ago. The one guarantee we have in life is that things are always changing. But many of us still send the message to ourselves that we really aren't good at change, that we don't like change, that we're not willing to embrace it and move forward. But like it or not, change is happening all the time. Even with basics like technology is continuously growing and changing every single day. And the real reason we tell ourselves that we're not good at change or we don't like change is because we're not actually giving ourselves what we need to change. And what we need is an acceptance and understanding that change happens instantly, but the transition that's needed takes time. I've worked in and with a lot of businesses in industries where change happens often and fast. And the companies I've worked for are all top names in their fields because they embrace change. Now, I completely understand that not all businesses need to change at the pace that the people I've worked for or with in the past need to do. But change is still a constant occurrence, even if it's something as simple as your IT systems get updated because your basis is Microsoft Office and they've updated how you use Microsoft Word and Excel. And there's a big difference between the change that's happening and the transition that's happening alongside it. The thing is, the transition takes a lot longer to complete because it involves feelings, emotions, thoughts, processing in our own heads, as well as the letting go of the old and the embracing of the new. So let's go for an example that most people are probably familiar with on one side of the coin or the other, perhaps even both. So let's say you've got a leader of a team and the leader and the team get on really well, they gel, everything flows, and one day the leader announces that they're leaving. The change to the new leader happens quite literally overnight. But the acceptance of that change, the embracing of that change, may take days, weeks, or months for everybody involved, including the leader that left. Let's say that leader gives a month's notice. So as soon as it's announced that that leader is leaving, immediately staff members start to think about the change that's coming. They're thinking about the ending of a positive, well-working relationship that's disappearing. This is likely to be the most emotional time for all staff members because they're starting to realise what they're losing. And there'll also be a lot of contemplation around what they might need to let go of. And a lot of that is assumptions. At this point, there might be a lot of emotions being flown around, things like shock and denial and frustration. because we've been in this lovely level of comfort for a little while. We've had a leader that's created stability, a positive relationship with us that helps us work well. And now we're having to think about the idea of going into an unstable period. And eventually we just accept that our leader is leaving, and on their last day, they're gone. But even possibly before our leaders even left and the change has actually occurred, we've started the next phase of transition, which is the neutral zone. Especially once the old leader is gone, we have no choice but to let go of the old. So that's gone now, and the way of working before has disappeared. But we haven't met our new boss yet, and we've no idea what they're going to be like or how they're going to work, and we haven't learned to work with them yet. There's this weird little period of confusion where, despite carrying on with the exact same job we were doing yesterday, we've now no idea which way to head to do it. A lot of people experience feelings like depression or numbness or disorientation because now they feel confused about absolutely everything and which way they're supposed to head. So it just feels a little bit out of balance. So other things like overthinking can easily kick in. But after a few weeks of working with the new leader, we start to move into a new beginnings phase. We start to really understand what we've learned about our new leader, how they prefer to work, how's best to communicate with them. We start to learn little bits about their personality and who they are. We start making decisions about what we're committed to and how committed we are. We start getting excited about the possibility of new challenges or these new ideas that this new leader has, and we move forward. This process of accepting endings, moving into a transition zone, and then embracing new beginnings is called Bridges' transition model. And there's a whole flow of emotions and feelings that come with it. So, what we need most of all when any change occurs is time. The change happened overnight. One day you've got one leader, and the next day you've got a different leader. But the transition from moving from one to the next and still being productive, efficient, and effective in our roles takes a lot longer than just one day. Hence the title of today's episode. Change really doesn't happen overnight. So I'm going to share with you some key thoughts and lessons that I've learned about change over the years and how to manage that transition so actually you can embrace change to the best of your ability and go first, making sure your team follow behind you. In 2010, a Stanford professor named Bob Sutton discussed something he labelled the toxic tandem, which he defined as when bosses don't pay attention to their employees, but those same employees are still watching him. An example he gave about this was when redundancies were due to happen in a certain company. And one day, the leader found out about these redundancies and chose to not tell anyone anything. Soon after, one of his secretaries or assistants came up to him and said, "When are the layoffs happening?" And the leader was a little bit shocked because he didn't realise that anybody actually knew about these layoffs. But they revealed that they'd managed to figure it out because he was having what they termed an interesting shoes day. All it took was something bad to happen, and that leader could no longer stand to look people in the eye, so he started looking down at his shoes. Employees quickly figured out that this was because layoffs were coming and he didn't want to tell anyone. How many times have you heard that a change is coming in your organisation or thought about a change that you need to make within the team, and suddenly you've had an interesting shoes day? Any time we hear that change is about to happen are things like fear of uncertainty, panic about instability, and quite often shock that change is happening in the first place. If we perceive something to be working well, stably, and positively, we don't always see the need for change. This is what we may refer to as the beginning of the end. We've been notified one way or another that change is coming, an end is happening, and suddenly we have to start thinking about all the things that we're going to lose, all the habits and practices and processes we're going to have to let go of, and the changes we may or may not have to make in our relationships with people. The thing is, you can't always control whether these emotions are going to come up for you or not. What you can control is how you work through them, back through to rationale and logic based on evidence that you have in your head, to accept that the change is coming and then present it to your team. So when we're practicing and exposing ourselves to the idea of change, that's the primary aim at the beginning of the end. To deal with all of our emotions properly, manage them and channel them into productive emotions that will be useful to our team, so that eventually we become more efficient at that thought pattern. Where possible, I was used to learn and read about any change that was happening on my own. And the reason I did that was because you don't know what you're about to read, and you've no idea how you're going to respond to it. So, if my reaction is going to be something that's going to immediately put my team off the idea of doing it, then that's the last thing I want them to see. But I also fully expect that they'll probably have the same range of emotions that I had. By working through the change on my own, by thinking about it, what I did was move through my own emotions by trying to seek out the why behind the change. If I could figure out why something was happening, immediately logical and rational thinking came flooding back into my head. And the more logic and rationale I had, the better I was able to channel my emotions of fear, anxiety, panic, all into things like enthusiasm, excitement about the challenge that was coming, and start seeing opportunities that we could take advantage of. And especially where a change was being made that we would clearly all really disagree with, that we could definitely see was not going to work. At the very least, I saw it as an opportunity to help the business learn and grow by encouraging my team to feed back what was happening so the business could then make better decisions going forward. Even failed changes were an opportunity for us all to learn, but most changes with a well managed transition can easily be successful. So the first step is managing yourself before trying to lead anyone else through change. And I will add one caveat to that. Be aware of how much time you're taking to work through those emotions and get back to that logical, evidence based, rational thinking, especially when you're practicing this for the first time, because the longer you spend trying to do this and trying to manage your emotions and channel them back into that positive place, the longer you're putting off the next key step to effective and positive and successful change. That interesting shoes day I mentioned earlier is probably the single biggest barrier to effective leadership of change. The longer you're staring at your shoes, the longer you're not actually talking to your staff about what's happening. It's okay to take a few minutes to deal with your own emotions and channel them into that positive space. But as soon as that's done, your staff need to know everything you know. You've probably experienced at some point or another this feeling that you're only supposed to tell staff on a need to know basis. But the truth is that unless you've been explicitly told that something you know is strictly confidential and your staff aren't included in that group, then there's no reason not to share everything you know with your staff. This isn't just restricted to change, this is inclusive of everything that you know in terms of knowledge, skills, behaviours. This is all of your habits, this is all the stuff that textbooks can't teach them. It's the information, the vision, the mission, the values, the strategy, the company goals, everything that's coming from head office, all the information you're being given, including financial targets, why they matter and how we get there, should be shared far and wide with your team. If you feel that you haven't got enough information about the change that you're about to tell them, then tell them that, but say, I've asked for the information, I'm waiting for a reply. Communication is everything in change. If you think about how long it might take you to process your own emotions around all of this, how much you might ponder on it, how much you might overthink something, how many assumptions are going to come into your head between now and the change happening, well, your team need just as much time to process all of that. So the earlier you start, the more likely they are to have worked through it properly by the time the change actually happens, and they will have accepted that the change is happening and be on board with the idea of following you through it. It also gives them a chance to ask any questions that they want answering, stuff that you may not need the answer to, but they do. So you can go back to whoever's above you and ask for that information. It gives them a chance to talk through their fears and concerns about the change so that actually you can help them feel reassured about what support they're going to get and how they're going to move through the change. Even simple things like when it's going to happen or how it's going to happen or what training and support they're going to get are all questions that people want answers to as soon as they know about change. So the sooner you've got that information, the better. Share with your team everything you know. There is no such thing as a secret unless you've specifically been told your staff are not to know. But your communication also needs to travel back up the chain. You need to advise your senior leaders on what it is that you need to help your team move through this as efficiently and effectively as possible. And one of the things you need for every single change that will ever happen in your team is a decrease in productivity. Now, as I say that, I can literally hear the screams of horror coming from all the senior managers listening to this. But consider what's happening while that change is occurring. Old habits, practices, processes are all being let go of. And your teams have now got to learn new skills, behaviours, knowledge, develop all of that and grow, explore all the things that they can do to tailor it to their own personal way of working, and get back into some sort of rhythm. So during that time, the same level of productivity that you were having before the change occurred just isn't possible. So this is the moment you need to start employing your problem solving skills. Think through the whole scenario from start to finish and figure out how much leeway you need during that time. How much does productivity need to decrease by to allow this change to happen effectively? For example, in a sales driven team, you might need to decrease your sales by hundreds or thousands, depending on how much you usually do, for that 1 week or day or however long it is that the change is happening over. You'll also need to decrease it during any time that your staff will need to take out to train and learn all of these new skills, because they can't do a whole day's training session and complete a whole day's work at the same time. It's just not possible. So some sort of reduction needs to happen. In different types of teams, for example, project teams where you're potentially working on longer term projects for your clients, you might need to think about any delays that you may need to prepare them for, or a reduction of tasks that needs to occur so that people have got time to think about how this project is going to be affected by what they're learning. You also need to get rid of the unnecessary. Any meetings that do not need to happen, get rid of them. Any unnecessary steps in processes, get rid of them. It's a really good chance to have a clear out of everything you're doing so you and your team can really think about how can we be the most productive when this change has finally happened, rather than making this change something we're just piling on top of the jobs list we've already got to do. Whatever it is you figure out you and your team need, you need to have clear communication back up the chain to your senior leaders about what exactly it is you need to make this happen for them. It's also a good chance to relay any fears or concerns that they've got that actually you don't have the answers to. Any points they may have raised that senior leaders may have not considered yet. This is the time for problem solving. So if we were to draw a map of this, you might say senior leaders have made the decision that the change is happening and they've communicated it down to you. You then read about the change, process your own thoughts and feelings on it, and pass all that information down to your team. So it's gone from the very top of the chain to the very bottom of the chain. It then needs to come back up again. Your staff need to talk to you and you need to listen. Listen to understand. If you want to learn more about listening to understand, listen to episode 4 of this podcast. Listening is your most powerful tool. Once you've listened to understand, you can then establish what information it is that you need to pass back up the chain even further to the senior leaders, and the senior leaders need to listen to understand. They can answer any questions, grant any requests, give you reasons why certain things can't be met. And again, that information flows back down the chain all the way to your staff and back up again. You are essentially the middleman, but communication needs to consistently flow. And the single most critical thing that all this communication creates is accountability. As more and more information flows about this change, everybody begins to be aware of about what their role is and what they're going to have to learn and what they need to change and who they need to help and how they need to help themselves. There's a much deeper level of understanding about what part everybody's going to play in this change. And if everybody's in on the plan, then everybody is accountable to each other for making this change happen. And psychologically and emotionally, you and your staff begin to move through to the transition phase. So communicate, problem solve, and plan your way to readiness for change to happen. I won't touch too much on the transition phase because actually there's quite a lot that you can do to support your staff that's already been put in a structure for you. All of the training days that have been scheduled for you, all the handouts you've been given, all the information that you've discussed already, all the plans that have already been made are now just simply being executed. The most important thing is to make sure that in terms of the process and the core skills that everybody needs, that they've got it. And after that, it's about encouraging your staff to experiment with what they've learned, to figure out how it's going to work with who they are and help them find their rhythm and flow again. So start everyone off together as a group, as one team. Learn all of this stuff together and then start branching off into individual needs. And where possible, utilize those people who are gaining things quickly to support those who need that little bit more help. But what needs to happen after all of that is solidifying of sustainable change. Change can be made quite easily and people do it all the time, but whether they stick with it or not is another matter. What you need to do is establish what bar everybody's trying to meet, and when they've got there, agree that's where it's going to stay until the next time they need to change. So keep checking in with people individually and as a group and make sure that everybody's clear on what is the minimum expectation, any problems you've encountered along the way, and any solutions that you can share amongst the team to make that better for all. Any lessons you've learned through failure, and yes, this is the exact time to embrace failure, and understand at what point there is a consensus across the team that everybody has met the standard. And as for finding their own rhythm and flow, as long as they're not breaking any rules, as long as it's all compliant, there's no reason they can't do things their way. And make sure you include yourself in that reflection process, particularly how you've led the change. Ask yourself a series of questions to establish what exactly you did during that change to lead it from start to finish and help your team come with you. But there is one question I want you to erase off that list right now. And that question is, am I the best at doing this? Your job here is not to be the best at the change. Your job here was to lead the change. So ask questions that are relevant to that. Did I go first? Did I learn something every step of the way? Did I communicate in a way that allowed understanding from everyone? Did I embrace failure? Did I seek help when I needed it? Did I make my team feel safe enough to try? Asking questions like that will give you far more valuable information than whether or not you can do the task the best. And follow up on people's emotional state with it too. Have they got to that place of excitement and commitment that they're ready to sustain this change? Have they discovered all the whys and all the benefits? Did they, in fact, feel safe enough to come to you with problems, to try new things, to tell you when they failed? And look back to the very beginning of all of this. When they were first told about the change, did they get into a spiral of emotions? Did they work back through to logic and rationale quite quickly? Did they ask a lot of questions and just think about it for a while before just accepting the change? What happened for them in that time? Do they need any development so that the next time change happens, we can make that process more efficient, more practiced? They've got a plan for dealing with it. The physical act of change may happen in a moment, but the truth is the whole process of change includes the transition that you and everybody around you is experiencing from start to finish. And it's only once that transition is concluded that change is successful. So manage yourself before you try to lead others through change. Communicate absolutely everything you know and make sure that communication goes up and down and that you utilize listening just as much as your voice. Encourage and empower your team to embrace this change, try new things, experiment and find their flow again. And review and reflect with your team on the parts you all played. And remember, your part here was leadership. And throughout it all, manage your expectations and those around you. Stick to facts, problem solve, communicate all of that up and down the chain. Tell people what you need to make change happen. Change really doesn't happen overnight, but every stage of change needs you to go first. Don't manage change, lead it. Until next time, everyone.